now have a native 2.8 version for the Nikon mirrorless cameras is a game changer. With a 2.8 aperture, I can shoot anything from astro to daytime landscapes with ease. As an astro lover, I have experienced issues with other lenses with coma on the stars. This new 14-24 has almost zero coma, all the way stopped down to 2.8 and corner-to-corner sharpness. One benefit to 14mm is being able to use a longer shutter speed for astro. This is important because I can use a lower ISO and get a cleaner image without getting trails on the stars. Overall, I'm seriously impressed with this lens. I can tell you that it's rarely going to leave my camera and it's going to be a staple in my kit and replace the F-mount version since it's superior in sharpness and quality paired with the mirrorless cameras.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Nikon TV. It's a new year, we have new episodes, and for this episode we have a new prize giveaway. So before I talk about what we'll actually go through with this episode, let me talk about this prize giveaway. So, the Banff Center Mountain Film and Book Festival. I'm just going to call it the Banff Film Festival. Nikon's actually been a partner of this film festival for a number of years. I've actually been lucky enough to go to it. You get to meet some of the amazing filmmakers, you get to meet some amazing people who want to go and take in those films. It's just a really, really cool atmosphere because, well, part of it is it's in Banff. So we've been partnered with this film festival for a number of years, and they've been lucky, or they've been nice enough to, and we've been lucky enough to provide us with a prize for this episode. So it's called the Epic Film Bundle. Now, what that actually is going to take a little bit of explaining because usually once the actual film festival, which begins in November in Banff, once that film festival is over, they actually take all the films on a worldwide tour. So I've actually seen them here in Toronto, where I've actually gone to a local theater and watched some of the films. They do it all across the world. It's an amazing experience. But obviously in these times, you can't go and take the film festival around the world. So they're doing it, they pivoted, and they're doing it online. So they're doing a virtual world tour. So what this means is even if you don't win the prize tonight, you can actually go on to the link that we'll actually put in the comments below. And by going to that link, you can actually go and, they call it renting. You go and rent the videos in whatever bundle you choose. They have 4 currently right now. And you go rent those videos for up to 2 weeks. You can watch them as many times as you want. And you get to take in the amazing films that are put into the festival. So right now, they have a bundle of 4 that they're calling their Epic Bundle. It includes basically all of the videos that they're currently have released. So they've been nice enough to go and give us one of those Epic Bundles. So somebody who's watching tonight is going to be the happy owner for a 2-week time of being able to watch all of those videos. It's a really, really cool prize. I think retail, it's over $50 US, so it's like 70, 75 Canadian if I'm doing even remotely my math right. So that's a really, really cool prize. How are you going to win, you are asking yourself? Well, I'm going to ask you a question, one question at some point throughout the episode tonight, and everybody who answers it correctly, we're going to go and randomize all of your names. We'll go pull one of those names out of a hat, and that winner we will go and contact in the next couple days to let you know that you have won. Even if you didn't win, I would highly recommend go check out some of the previews for the festival. And if you do want to go and rent them yourself, you totally can. It's a really amazing experience if you can do it in person, but the next best thing for right now is to see it online. So thanks very much for to the Banff Film Festival for this really cool prize. Okay, so what are we talking about for the rest of the episode? Well, first off, I gotta say thanks to you guys because you gave me a ton of information about what you want to see from Nikon TV. This was in the last episode, the holiday edition that we held back in December. So taking all that information in, I've kind of tried to plan it out for the rest of the year. As always though, if there's other things that pop up into your brain that you guys want to learn about, throw it in the comments below and I'll definitely try and include it if I can. So tonight, what I'm doing is I'm including a brand new segment that I kind of brainstormed from some of what you had recommended. And what I'm calling the segment is how I set up my camera. Now, I'm gonna go and kick it off tonight, but throughout the rest of the year, I'm hoping to bring in some of our Nikon reps who actually work for Nikon, some of our Nikon ambassadors, maybe even some of our NPS members. I'm gonna have them go and pre-record a small little 1 or 2 minute long clip, send it in to us, and we can go and share that on the live episode as we're streaming it, so that you guys can go and see how different people set each of their cameras up. So they'll talk about what they use their camera for, how they set it up, and why they do that. So that'll be a really cool little segment, and I'm going to start it off today talking about something a little bit, I'll say, generic. So I'm not going to go through how I customize every single button on this. Maybe later on in the year I'll jump in and do that. But what I'm going to talk about very quickly is this little button on the back of the camera here. This is the AF on button. Now, not all of our cameras have an AF on button. I have the Z7 II right now. I had to look because you sometimes can't tell whether you have the Z6 or Z7 II. So I'm recording on the 6 II. I'm holding the Z7 II. Both of them have a dedicated AF on button. So I'm going to be talking about back button autofocusing tonight and why I do it, and why I feel it's a really, really key technique to really get the most out of your photography depending on how you shoot. Now, I say depending on how you shoot because I know the back button autofocus is a pretty divisive technique in the photographic community. Some people love it, swear by it. Other people think it's silly. Some people have never tried it. Some people just can't wrap their brain and get away from the muscle memory of just shooting and focusing all with the shutter button. So I'm going to quickly talk about and show a few examples for why I feel it's important. I'll say the main factor for if it can be important for you is, do you ever take photos of a subject that's not only stationary, but can become moving? That's kind of the key. If you're only ever shooting landscapes, okay, you can go and get away with the front button and not really notice a difference at all. But whenever you're dealing with subject matter that could start moving very, very quickly, and you're going to miss the action if you can't track them, that's really where back button autofocus comes into its own. Now, I will say that for for almost all of our cameras that do not have a dedicated AF on button, you'll almost always have an auto exposure, so it's an AE-AF is what it'll say on it. That little button can actually be programmed. I'm not going to go through how to do that with every camera because it's a little bit different for a lot of them. But for this camera, specifically for the Z series, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and show you how to separate the fact, and that's the main factor of back button autofocus, is you're separating the shutter button from taking the photo and autofocusing to just taking the photo. This AF on button is going to be the only thing that triggers autofocus. So how do we go and do that? Well, if you go into the menu, and we're going to go into the custom setting menu, we're going to go to A, autofocus, and on the Z7 II, it's A6. I do believe it kind of shifts around a little bit if you have a D780, a D850, but in this camera, it's A6. You're going to go to AF activation. Now, I already have mine set to AF on. By default out of the box, it is going to come with shutter/AF on, but I want you to set it to AF on only. That means that only the AF on button will trigger autofocus, and that is key. Now, why should you actually care about this? Well, a good example is I went for a hike with my dog on the weekend, went down to tire her out, but also I was going to go and take some pictures, so I brought my camera along with me. So if you're taking a photo and you have a subject, let's say you're taking a picture of a kid, or in this case a dog, normally if you're in AFS mode, so let's say you're shooting normally, you're focusing and taking the photo all with the shutter button, you're going to be in AFS mode because you're sometimes going to want to set your subject right smack dab in the middle. Let's say we have the autofocus point right smack dab in the middle, and you could take the shot. Okay, well that works. But what happens if your subject now kind of looks a certain way and you want to go and recompose the shot? Well, just like I did here. So if you're going to go and recompose the shot, you're going to focus on your subject. So you're going to physically move the camera, focus on your subject, and then recompose the shot so that the subject is off axis, like you see my little dog Tilly right now. So if that's the case, that works totally well because your subject isn't moving, you have time to focus, recompose, all is right with the world. But what happens if your subject starts to run towards you? They move around, they do something really, really cute, and you're shooting a portrait, so you're shooting very, very shallow depth of field. Well, if that depth of field is, or the focus is off just a little bit, then the whole photo is going to be ruined. So if you can't instantly go and start tracking your subject, this is really where back button autofocus comes into its own. Now, you might think, okay, well, Chris, why don't I just always be in AFC mode? So if I'm in AFC mode and my subject is right smack dab in the middle of the frame, well, totally fine. If they move, I just keep focusing and it follows them, no problem. But if we go and try and do that focus and recompose that we did before, where's that autofocus pointing? That autofocus is pointing now at the snow. Now, yes, you can go and move your autofocus point around, but again, you're going to be losing time if that subject does start to move. So this is now where a back button autofocus really, really makes a difference, because the key here is you don't have to switch between AFS and AFC mode when you're doing back button. Back button autofocusers always live in AFC mode. Well, hold on a second. How am I living in AFC mode if I'm doing landscape work or if I'm going and focus and recomposing? Well, that's the key thing here, is when I'm in AFC, if I want to go and take that shot where I focused and recomposed, I would focus on the dog, I would press the autofocus button, but then, this is key, you get off the autofocus button and recompose. As long as I'm not touching that AF on button, the camera's not focusing. So you're really, with back button autofocus, getting the best of both worlds. I'm getting the equivalent of AFS mode just by getting off the button. But if that subject starts to now run backwards, forwards, moving anywhere they want, I just lay in on the AF on button and the camera's gonna go and track them. So this is really, really powerful if you're doing any sorts of kid photography, portraiture, where you're not just doing a static studio shot. If you have some kind of movement and you really want to kind of have a dynamic shoot, well, by you being a back button autofocuser, if the subjects are fully stationary, you just get off the autofocus button, recompose, and shoot, and you're locked into that same distance. But if your subject all of a sudden starts moving, you have them start walking towards you, you're not having to fiddle with the buttons to switch from AFS to AFC. You just go and press in that button and track them as they come towards you. Specifically when we're dealing now with, let's say, mirrorless cameras that have eye detect autofocus, you really just kind of set it up and let the camera go and do its thing, and know that pretty much we have 90% coverage in the horizontal and vertical direction. So anywhere your subject is within the frame, your camera's going to be able to follow them. So it's a really, really cool effect. I could do an entire episode just on back button autofocusing, but I don't want to bore you guys too much. So if you do want to learn more, there are a ton of really, really good tutorials online on YouTube. Go check them out. It is definitely worthwhile. Will it mess with your brain for the first day or two or weeks or two? It probably will. There's a lot of muscle memory that we've built up with just focusing and shooting, focusing and shooting, focusing and shooting. But if you can break that, then I can guarantee you, if you deal with moving subjects a lot, then back button autofocus really starts to make a big difference. Okay, so what are we going to talk about next? Well, what I want to talk about next is night photography. Now, night photography was actually recommended to us by a couple people last time. Both Juan and Carrie both said, can we go and learn more about night photography? Juan asked specifically about astrophotography. Now, if he's talking, Juan, if you're listening in today, if you were talking about specifically doing astro, so talking about, let's say, using a really long telephoto, 200, 300 mil lens, set up on a motorized grid, then that's not quite where we're going to get into. That's very, very specialized. I'm going to talk about the more generalized night photography itself, specifically shooting star points. Now, in other episodes later on down the year, I will talk about shooting star trails. I'll also talk about doing some light painting and melding that in to shooting your night landscapes. So putting that all together is going to be kind of fun, but we kind of have to, well, we do have to start off somewhere. So let's start off at the basics. The basics are you do have to plan a little bit more for night photography than you normally would. So the first thing you have to think of is what accessories am I going to go and bring with me when I go out shooting? So the first I will say is bring an extra battery or two. Chances are you probably won't need it. Our cameras are quite good at shooting long, many shots without having to kill the batteries too much. Even if you go and read about mirrorless cameras and how they drain the batteries more than, let's say, a DSLR counterpart, that is true. But is it really gonna hamper you that much? Probably not. But if you are shooting long exposures, that could drain the battery a little bit more. If you're gonna be shooting long exposures at night, when it's usually a little colder, that will be able to drain, or that will drain the battery a little bit more. And then if you are gonna be shooting long exposures at night, in the winter, that's kind of the worst possible combination because we all know that the colder the ambient temperature gets, the worse the battery performance gets. So bring a couple batteries just to make sure, keep them in your pockets, keep them nice and warm, and you'll be good. Obviously, you will want some wide angle, relatively fast apertured lens. There's a number of ones that we have, whether it's the 14 to 24, the new 14 to, well, newish, 14 to 30 f4, or one of our 20 mil options, whether it's for DSLR f-mount or our Nikkor Z 20 mil f1.8. Either of those are really fast and quite wide for most situations. So you'll definitely want a lens as well. Now, one other thing I'll definitely recommend is a tripod, and specifically a good tripod. I know that sounds silly, everybody wants a good tripod. Now, I know I work for Nikon, so I shouldn't be doing an entire episode on another brand's tripod, but I gotta tell you, me personally, I have fallen in love with my own Gitzo. This is my Gitzo that's basically gone everywhere in the world with me, from everywhere across Canada to the US to Hawaii to Africa. Pretty much everywhere that I can take it, it goes with me. The nice thing about it, and I've gone through my fair share of tripods, is it's light enough, it is carbon fiber, and it's able to be compact enough to pretty much go anywhere with me. I didn't go for the super compact tripod option because I still go and do use quite a lot of longer lenses, so I do want to make sure that the capacity of the legs and the head are there. So I kind of went with an in-between model that wasn't too light or too heavy. But that's really going to depend on what you are going to be using it for. Are you going to be hiking in for 5-10 kilometers to go get to your spot? Well, you're going to want a lighter tripod that's going to afford you to be able to do that. But if you're just going to basically be driving in everywhere and just popping it out of your trunk, well, you can afford to have something a little bit heavier and clunkier. But whatever you do, make sure you buy as good of a tripod as you can afford. That sounds silly because obviously budget matters for every type of purchase that you make. But I've gone through so many tripods trying to find the right one, always thinking, well, I'll just spend $100. And then you realize, oh geez, it doesn't do this. Okay, I'll spend $300. It still doesn't do this. Okay, well, I'll spend $600-700. So the more and more tripods you go through, if you go and spend a little bit more money at the outset, then you will be happier in the long run. So I went, made the jump buying this Gitzo. It is a Gitzo that I jumped in and got. I absolutely love it. I've had it for about 8 or 9 years now. It is just spectacular. On top of the legs, you also want to go and get yourself a good head as well. So I went with a ball head. Personally, I went with the Markins. I absolutely love it. It's small, light, but really good in terms of what it's able to hold without really kind of creeping too much. There's a lot of other good ones out there, Really Right Stuff, Acrotech. There's a lot of good ones. So I'm not saying that Markins is the only one to go for, but me personally, it's a Markins head with Gitzo legs. That's what I've decided on. But definitely pick the best solution for you, what you can afford, what works with your weight and size limits, and what I'll say the heaviest lens or combination of body and lens that you think that you'll be using. Okay, so we have the lens, we have the batteries, we have the tripods. The last thing I would recommend is a trigger of some sort. Now, I say trigger of some sort because ideally, when we're doing night photography, we're going to be shooting for 5 seconds, 20 seconds, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour. We're going to want to really minimize the amount of camera shake that we, the photographer, introduce into the photo. Now, Our Nikon cameras have a ton of different features, from exposure delay mode to mirror up mode if you're shooting with a DSLR, to first curtain electronic shutter, which tries to get rid of even the minute effect of, let's say, shutter shock, which is the actual effect of the shutter opening. Basically, the shutter opens and then the sensor turns itself on electronically to get rid of any vibration that would be caused by the shutter moving. So we have a lot of those features as well. But I really like specifically our WR10 system. We just came out with the WR10 trigger, but we also have the new WR11 little adapters. I don't actually have any here with me, but they actually are what plugs into the camera and allows you to send the radio signal. So that radio signal is key because I do quite a lot of light painting when I shoot at night. So I'm usually not right next to my camera. And if, let's say I had an infrared and you have to be between, I don't know, 5 and 10 feet away, being able to point directly at your camera, I don't always have that luxury. I'm sometimes 30, 40 feet away getting ready to go and paint my environment. So this is my choice. It's very cool. You get about 60, 70 feet worth of distance. I've gotten further, but that's in ideal situations. But the other nice thing about it is that it also works if you have a compatible body and an SB5000 as a flash trigger. So you can now go and trigger your SB5000 off camera with radio signals by using the WR11, A or B, depending on which port you have. Okay, so we're all set with our accessories. We have the remotes, the batteries, the tripods, and our lenses. Now what? Well, this is where the first section of where kind of people gets a little bit scared really comes into its own. It's figuring out the exposure. Now, regardless of whether you shoot manual in your everyday shooting lives, most people don't, so this is kind of extra scary. I would highly recommend to shoot raw and to shoot in manual mode. And this is really where a lot of people go, oh God, he's telling me I gotta shoot manual, I gotta figure out my shutter speed, aperture, and ISO all by myself, and oh God, how am I gonna? Don't worry, for the one thing, we're shooting with digital. We're not going and shooting, we don't have 24 exposures on a film roll that we could ruin and waste. We are shooting with photons here. So we can just go and grab those pixels, shoot, fire, get it wrong 50 times. That's okay, it hasn't cost us money. So don't worry about it, we'll get through it. So there's 3 main things you have to worry about: your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. Let's start off with the aperture, the easiest one. Generally, you're gonna be shooting wide open. That's pretty much a given. Regardless of whether you have an f4 lens, you'll definitely shoot wide open. Even an f2.8, like a 24 to 70 or 14 to 24, you're usually gonna be shooting wide open. The one time you may not be is if you are shooting, let's say, a 20mm f1.8. Sometimes you might stop down for whatever reason, but even then, usually you'll shoot wide open just to gather as much light as you possibly can. So aperture, easy, wide open. Now, shutter speed. The shutter speed, when you're shooting star points, which is what we're talking about tonight, is really key because you want to kind of find that balance of having the shutter open long enough that you actually capture enough light to make a good exposure, but you don't want to go and have the shutter open long enough that you start to see those star trails. As soon as you start to see those star trails, that for me is a no-go. So how do you find that balance? Well, you can just go randomly shoot. You can go and shoot like this shot here, taken out in Banff, where I think this is actually taken one of the first times I worked the Banff Film Festival. So you can see here I'm at 24 millimeters, and that's key. The focal length is key. And you can see that the shutter speed is just under 1 minute long. Well, as we kind of zoom in, you can see that it is definitely too long of a shutter speed. Okay, well, how do we figure it out? Well, it's not as easy as just one shutter speed works all the time, because the focal length that you're shooting at actually helps dictate what your shutter speed should be. Now, the reason for that is just like if you're shooting with, let's say, a 500mm lens, you're going to see more camera shake than with a wide angle lens. Similarly, when you're using a very long telephoto lens or even a mid-range, you're going to start to see star trails earlier than you would if you shoot with a wide angle lens. So, nice and easy here. The rule of 500. That's how you figure out your shutter speed. What you do is you take 500, you divide it by your focal length, and that gives you your basic shutter speed. So 500 divided by this 24 millimeter from this example gives you roughly 21 seconds. Now, the rule of 500 is how a lot of photographers do it, but I'm, as you've probably figured out if you watched the Nikon TV at all, I'm a little bit picky. So I actually don't use the rule of 500, I use the rule of 400. So the rule of 400 is just a little bit more conservative. So if I go and take 500 divided by 24, I'm now no longer at 21 seconds, I'm at 17 seconds, which is what the final exposure I shot at for this picture was. I shot 17 seconds, pretty sure I was wide open. I had a 24 to 120 at the time, I think. So I think I was at f4. So that's a really easy way to figure out your shutter speed, is to use either the rule of 500 or, and this is key, what I use it for, which is the rule of, or how I figure it out, which is the rule of 400. So rule of 400, remember that, it might be important later. So aperture wide open, shutter speed, rule of 400. Now what do we do with the ISO? Now this is where it's going to be a little bit of trial and error, because there's no one ISO fits all, because the environment that you're in, regardless of how dark it is, whether the moon is out, how much light pollution do you have from a nearby city, all those factors are going to kind of go together to figure out what ISO you have to shoot at. So I would say start at 3200, 4000 ISO. That's a good starting point. Take a couple examples, figure it out, figure out your aperture, your shutter speed, set your ISO. Is it too dark? Okay, raise your ISO. Is it too bright? Lower your ISO, and kind of go from there. So within 3 or 4 shots, you're able to get pretty close to what it is the final exposure should be. Now, once you do have that final exposure, what do you do? What's the next step? Once you have your exposure all set and you go to start taking your first photos. Well, what most people do, and what I do to some degree as well, is point the camera straight up, find the Milky Way, take a photo. Okay, well, that works, but how many of those type of photos are you going to take before you get bored? I can tell you it'll happen pretty quickly. If it's your first time seeing the Milky Way, you might be out there for 15, 20 minutes, kind of taking a few different shots, recomposing a little bit here and there, but how many of those pictures are you going to use afterwards? You're pretty much going to find the best one and just stick with that. So what I really recommend when it comes to night landscape star photography is to really bring that landscape in. Try and find some other focal point that you can use to kind of meld in with the stars. So that first shot that I showed you what not to do with the long shutter speed, this is the kind of the final image that I was able to get with it. And in this case, I will be the first to say that those stars aren't the main focal point. It's actually the mountain. But to be honest, that's okay. That kind of really ethereal look that you get from the weird light that's coming off of those clouds, it's a really cool effect. So I'm fine that the stars are kind of sitting a little bit in the back seat. But there are other situations where you find the Milky Way and you say then, okay, well, there's the Milky Way. What else can I use in my foreground to really go and kind of take this photo to the next level? Well, you can go and find trees, you can go and find other existing landmarks around you, and they really help kind of elevate your photo from just a photo of the Milky Way to really kind of bring in the environment, letting you remember where you were when you took that shot. Because if you have 50 Milky Way shots, how are you going to remember where you were? Yeah, you take 1 or 2, they're good shots that you're going to want to keep, but it may not remind you of all the amazing times, all the amazing memories that you had on this trip that you were on. So it really is just a way to expand your creativity, especially in later episodes as we talk about light painting, when you really want to go and build out even more on top of the star point photography that we talked about today. And that's really key, is once you're able to be comfortable getting your settings and looking for different, I'll say, vantage points from where you are, knowing how to start with this star point exposure, you're really able to just go nuts. You're able to go and use the same base formula to go and do star trails. You can go and do now light painting. So just by kind of knowing the shutter speed, aperture, ISO of star points really allows you to go a lot further. Okay, so I think that's a good place to start as a primer for night photography. Now, I haven't asked a question yet for that epic prize bundle that we're going to be giving away that the Banff Film Festival was nice enough to provide. So the question that I want you guys to answer in the comments below is, how do I, Chris, figure out my shutter speed when I'm figuring out my overall exposure for star points? What rule, hint, hint, what rule do I use when it comes to figuring out my shutter speed? Okay, so I want you to go and put the answer to that question below in the comments. And what we're going to do is contact the winner in a couple days to let them know they have access to the Epic Prize Bundle by the Banff Film Festival. Okay, so as always, I'm going to remind you guys to go and talk about in the comments below things that you want to know about. Is it information on lenses? Is it specific differences in the bodies that we have? Is it photographic techniques like we talked about today with night photography and specifically star photography? So there's a lot of different topics we can talk about. You let me know what you want to hear about, and I'll be able to build that into future episodes. So until then, I want to say to everybody, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next episode.